The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Supervisors Learning Collaborative, sponsored by the Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery. I am Dawn Miller, and we have with us again today Paul Phares, who is going to be doing the presentation today. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Dawn. Good afternoon, everybody. Today's call is going to be on the topic of job development. And so just a quick note, qualification-wise. So I have been an IPS supervisor in the past, and I work in the state of Illinois as a Fidelity reviewer for IPS programs across the state. And so when Dawn asked me to put something together on the topic of job development, I was very eager to do so because I'm fascinated by job development. It is, on one hand, this what seems like this very simple thing that employment specialists do, this function that they do, but the reality is it's really hard and there's some science to it, and it kind of feels like sales to some people. And I've talked with hundreds of employment specialists that talk about job development as if it's some sort of unpleasant part of the job. And I'm here today really to try to convince even just one person that if you go into it kind of thinking about it the right way, it doesn't have to be so unpleasant. So let's go ahead and kind of get started here. Just for context, what you'll hear from me today in the presentation is not necessarily Washington State specific. I want to make sure I make that clear. This is just me assembling some best practices, some common approaches, maybe giving examples of agencies that have done this with full implementation. They've demonstrated good outcomes. And a lot of the content you'll hear from me today is IPS Fidelity Scale driven. If you don't have a copy of the IPS Fidelity Scale, I encourage you to get a hold of one. This will tell you exactly how your organization will have fidelity reviews occur. And in the state of Washington, those are questions when we're done with the slide material, Washington specific questions Dawn may be able to help us answer. So if you're on the call, hopefully you already know what I would consider to be the basics of IPS and these core principles. Everything in the Fidelity Scale really stems from these core principles. And you can see that some of these, it's not too much of a stretch to think that some of these are actually related to job development, like rapid job search, competitive employment, attention to preferences. These are all things that should be a part of our focus anyway in IPS, and certainly should be a part of our focus with job development in particular. Just some context for the Fidelity Scale. If you're on the call and you happen to be from an agency that is not a direct IPS service provider, you know, the IPS Fidelity Scale is really for those IPS agencies. Vocational rehabilitation, for example, they have their own rules and guidelines to follow. The Fidelity Scale, however, does have content that pertains to vocational rehab. So the whole idea of Fidelity is that IPS agencies are only reviewed on how closely they align with the Fidelity content. So the examples, as I said before, are really just organizations with full implementation and they've achieved exemplary fidelity or best practices. So what really is it? It's funny, if you go to an organization who does IPS and you ask them what is job development, you really get all shades of different answers. And you know, there is a definition that's out there. There are several definitions out there, actually. The one I like the most is this one here: a purposeful, planful approach to understand competitive jobs in the marketplace. The reason why I like it, first of all, is the two words purposeful and planful. Agencies that really struggle with job development are also the ones who don't make job development purposeful and they don't make it planful. But really, job development is the IPS agency's efforts to understand the jobs in the marketplace. That's really why I like this, because it's more than just going out and getting a lead. It's more than just going out and seeing if somebody's hiring. It is a long-term discussion or a long-term relationship with an employer wherein you learn about what they consider to be a great applicant and a great employee so that you can turn that into a placement in the community. Good job development is in the community. That's where the jobs are. Agencies that struggle, that I've seen struggle, sometimes they try to do phone-based job development, and I can tell you that will not work in the long run. Job development is face-to-face, As I indicated earlier, it's relationship-oriented and it's outcome-driven. It's important to think about the employment specialist in job development as the intermediary between the client seeking employment and the employer seeking a great applicant. And you're really trying to play matchmaker between the two. In the Fidelity scale, in the services section, there is specific language regarding job development, specifically around the frequency of employer contact. So each employment specialist makes at least 6 face-to-face contacts each week. And this is really important to develop employer relationships. It's important to find out about those job leads. It is a way to think about productivity for employment specialists, something other than employment outcomes. The more contacts an employment specialist can put together, that really means it's the more potential employers they're working with, and then it's more likely that they'll have a strong placement. Job development can be generic or client specific, and I will just put a word of caution out here that I think a danger zone for IPS agencies is when they're doing job development in that kind of generic realm. It is always best to have client-specific job development. And if you think back to the preferences slide, or the slide about the principles where it said client preferences, if we're paying attention to the client preferences, where they want to work or what kind of jobs they want to have, that should really be driving our job development out into the community. And sure, it's not a one-size-fits-all, and there are always, opportunities where, maybe it's for a client, but maybe not specifically yet today. And I understand those are examples that people use to kind of refute this statement that I'm saying. But the reality is, it certainly should be more client-specific than generic. And then tracking is key for this section of the Fidelity scale, the frequency of employer contact, because when a Fidelity reviewer comes in to review your IPS agency, they'll want to see evidence that employment specialists average at least 6 face-to-face contacts per week. And so I'll talk near the end of the presentation today a little bit about ways you can track that, and you might not be surprised to know it can look a variety of different ways. So you'll have to come up with what works best for your organization for sure. Another area of the Fidelity scale that looks at job development is this quality of employer contact. So in contrast to the last one, which is really just how many times do we get out and go see an employer, this one really looks at the relationship. And I think this one is a really important part of the Fidelity scale, but the definition here in the Fidelity scale is that employment specialists are building relationships with employers through multiple visits in person that are intended to learn the needs of the employer. And if you just think about what that means and how you would even show that, you really start to understand what I led with, that we really need to be thinking about job development as a long-term, not one-off, but long-term process wherein we're really developing a relationship with an employer. The Fidelity scale goes on to say these 4 bullet points that we would expect to see multiple visits to build relationships. We'd expect job development to occur with and without clients. We'd expect job development to be occurring when there are openings at an employer and when there aren't openings at an employer. And the purpose, back to that word purpose, it's really intended to learn the needs of the employer in order to match clients to a good fit. And so if you think about that last bullet point with what I said a slide ago about being the matchmaker, this really is what it comes down to for me when I think of generic versus client specific. How can you determine good fit for a client if you're not thinking about a client or multiple clients on your caseload when you're doing job development? So I just think there's a little incongruity there that it's worth really thinking about as you go about job development. So the process that I really advocate for with regards to job development when I go out and talk with organizations is 3 cups of tea approach. And if you're familiar with it, this might be a review. If you're not familiar with it, it's really based on a book. And the book isn't about job development or IPS. It's about something completely different. But there's a quote in this book that is on the screen here. And it really takes this metaphor of drinking tea with someone over time, over multiple cups of tea to develop the relationship. And so, IPS has really kind of embraced this 3 cups of tea approach. And so really what it comes down to is, in this first cup of tea, this is your introductory visit. This is typically unscheduled. This might be stopping in because you see a sign, or you heard from another employee that they were a customer at a particular employer and they saw that they were hiring. So goals in this first cup of tea, this first touch with an employer, would be a very brief overview of the purpose of your visit. And so that is going to be to talk about their positions, refer applicants to them, etc. And really the main goal is scheduling that longer conversation, the second cup of tea. It's important here, since these usually are brief, very, very brief. Anything you can leave with the employer, print media like a card, business card. Some agencies use brochures. Other agencies, and there are all kinds of things that other agencies use to leave in the hands of the employer so that they have something to kind of remember you by, is very important here. A lot of times we'll find that employers are very, very busy their day, especially smaller employers like a self-employed organization. You might be literally catching them on the way to 10 other things. And so you've really got to have something tangible for them to walk away with. So some notes that I would share with you for this first cup is, have a plan. Think about, before you walk in the door, what is your mission for the visit? If you're going into a restaurant, think about, that's a busy place, right? A restaurant. So think about, how are you going to get the conversation to go to, well, maybe I can come in at a later date when you have more time, and try to set it up from the very beginning. Be as prepared as possible, and this is if you can, of course. Some of those where you're literally driving around and see a place and you go walk in, there's a limit to the preparation you can do. But there's nothing, if you're going to go job develop at a particular organization or agency or employer, there's nothing wrong at all with looking online. Go look at their website. Do they have anything posted already that you could kind of jumpstart the conversation with? So do a little bit of research, do a little bit of homework, and it can go a long way towards kind of speeding up this first cup. And always have your calendar with you. Walk in the door with your notebook, your calendar, because often if you say, is there a better time for me to come back? They might say Tuesday at 9 a.m. So you got to book it while you've got them right there, because they may not specifically book it. They may just be saying it out loud. It helps to try to really get a specific time to come back. The second cup then, this is a little longer discussion about the needs of the employer. This is where you can maybe go into a little bit more detail about the overview of your IPS program. Goals here include understanding their current positions, both what they have open and what they employ. Maybe it's not a vacancy today, but what are other positions that aren't available today but might come open later? Another point of emphasis, I think, that's very important for employment specialists in the second cup, learn about ideal candidates. Ask the employer, what's a great candidate look like to you on paper? And then when you get that answer, ask them, what does a great candidate look like in an interview? And what kind of things are danger zones for you? What do you worry about? What does somebody need in order to be a high performer in your organization? This is really the time to ask those questions. And then also ask all the questions you can about the workplace conditions. So is there a lot of standing? Is it loud? Those are all things that help you understand if it's the right employer for someone on your caseload as well. Notes here, again, do a little research on the employer. Anything you can between the first cup and the second cup is going to help you even a little bit. And don't try to cram all the questions in this one meeting. This step might take place over many, many smaller visits. You certainly don't want to have a relationship forming meeting where you're interrogating the poor employer. So, try to have a sense for when it's enough, either due to the employer being very busy or just because it's been a lot of question and answer. And then most importantly, I think, is the last note. Listen, if they're telling you about what they think is an ideal candidate or what their workplace conditions are, listen in earnest, take great notes, and bring them back to your team because all of those little pieces of information get cobbled together into really an opinion from a client about whether they want to go apply at this position. So it's important to try to paint as good a picture as you can for your clients about what this job might be like, so that they can make an informed choice. And the third cup really is to infinity. So this is the employer relationship over time. Goals here include communication. And, I really think it's great work when teams are checking in, even when they don't have an applicant, kind of keeping the relationship fresh. So maybe there's a restaurant and you've got a relationship with the employer. You've gotten to the second cup. You don't have any applicants. It's still okay to go talk with that employer and refresh them and just ask, has anything changed, or do you have any additional openings since the last time we talked? Another goal here is communication. You already see the theme developing, right? Have a conversation about an applicant that wasn't hired or about an employee that was let go. Often, employment specialists are a little tentative here when somebody's not hired, or especially if an employee is let go. And the reality is, those are the best times to go learn about either A, what did they do wrong that led to them being let go or led to them not being hired, but also, from the employer perspective, was it not a good fit, or was it not as good a candidate as we thought? But that is a conversation that is very rich with information for the employment specialist and for the employment specialist to share with the client. Here's why it happened, or here's why you weren't hired. They said you were falling asleep in the interview. So those are great opportunities for employment specialists to learn more about what went wrong, and then just asking those questions about what went wrong help the employer learn that you're there for the long haul and that it's a trusting relationship. And then the third communication here for the goals is, don't assume that no news is good news with a placement. Once you've got somebody hired, if you're not hearing anything bad, that's great, except go one better and reach out to the employer and check in regularly. How's it going? Are you noticing anything? Is there anything they could be doing more of or less of to be a better employee? And again, there's a richness in those conversations. And the whole point of IPS is that, as these notes indicate here, there's a high degree of support to the client and the employer. So the employer can tell you early on when they're noticing things, as opposed to, letting it get to be too big that now they've got to deal with it. You can help the very early stages to help somebody understand, the right path instead of the wrong path. And then the last note here, and it's just really more of an FYI, job development really has to be a continuous process. It's not as simple as we follow the 3 cups of tea of method and I've had my third meeting and therefore we're done with job development. It has to keep going. Hiring managers change, new jobs are created, jobs are not reopened once they're vacated. There's so many things that happen out there in the world of competitive employment that it is to your advantage to just continue job development and really never stop. View that as a vital function of the employment specialists. So general things to remember: to the degree that you can, research the employer. This seems like a really simple one, but you'd be amazed at how many times people just make a miss here. Avoid busy times to get full attention. So I've heard employment specialists tell me that they went to a restaurant over lunchtime or the dinner hour because they were certain a manager would be present. And I'm telling you, those managers are right in the middle of the busiest time of their day. They don't want to step away from behind the register or and have a conversation about something. They need to be doing what they're doing. So think about that when you're going into an employer for the first time and then for the second time. And then, like I said earlier, have a plan. When you're starting to develop a relationship with an employer, have a plan. What are you trying to do with it? Are you trying to go for a specific position, or do you want to learn more about everything? Some employers have multiple positions available under their roof, and you may be thinking you're going there for one position, but the reality is, if you go there and learn about all of them, you might end up having much better outcomes. And then I always like to advocate to agencies to create their material or create a packet or something you can put in the hand of an employer. That could be business cards, like I said, IPS specific brochures, have your calendar ready. And what I like to call is an elevator speech. Have a 30-second script ready to go. So when you get in front of an employer who only has 30 seconds, you can give them the very high point information, what they need to know, and why they should schedule a second time to connect with you. Having that scripted out and practiced a few times can really go a long way to eliminating some of that anxiety that employment specialists might be having when they're out in the field, and make them feel a little bit more confident when they're going into an employer for the first time. So some fears, since I said anxieties. These are the two that always come up, rejection and it feels awkward. So, these are legitimate questions that employment specialists have asked me and just kind of rhetorically asked out loud. What if they don't want to work with me? What if I mess up? Well, you might mess up, right? We're all human, and they might not want to work with you, and that's okay. That's their prerogative. Remember, it's long term. So somebody saying, not today, I'm not hiring. That rejection there doesn't mean that they're never going to be hiring. And often, what we see is employers are much more willing to work with you the more often they see you, because they start to develop a relationship with you and then they trust you. And then as far as the awkwardness of job development, I've had people tell me it feels like sales, it feels like I'm bothering people at work. Well, those are both kind of true. It is kind of like sales. You're selling your organization's work, and you are kind of bothering them at work, but the bothering, that's a pejorative word that we've created, and the reality is you're trying to help them. And I think if you can kind of flip that script a little bit with them, it can really help go a long way towards helping them understand you're not there to sell them something. They want good applicants. They want great employees. You're there to help them get that. So keep a couple things in mind here. In general, employers follow the stages of change regarding acceptance of your help in finding applicants, right? Some immediately accept your help. Others are kind of hot and cold. And then you've got some, I'm sure, if you've done any job development, where it just seems really tough to break in to that employer. For some reason, it just doesn't, you can go in and talk to them and they say, sure, and you can have people apply, but they don't ever seem to get an interview. Those things all take time to flesh out. And you are uniquely qualified in this field because you most likely know about things like stages of change and motivational interviewing. And those things can help, you can help employers move into other stages by helping them understand the value that you're trying to bring. And then really, I think sometimes people kind of groan or roll their eyes, but there's nothing that can take the place of practicing responses to rejection, or what I consider to be the worst reception, which is lukewarm. With a rejection, a flat-out rejection, at least I can read that really clearly. Often when you get into an employer and you're meeting them for the first time, those lukewarm receptions are really tough to flesh out. Are they or aren't they on board? They're kind of saying they're on board, but man, I just don't believe it. It doesn't seem like they're on board. So practice your responses. What would you say if an employer said A, B, or C? And these are all good things for you to be doing with your IPS team. Maybe if you have a once a month meeting or a huddle or something like that, you can just take 5 or 10 minutes out of the agenda and just practice a few responses, and then go out in the field and test them out, see how they go. So for tracking, a couple things that are what I would consider to be the bare minimums that if you want to really track job development in a good way, these are some things you'll want to look at. So we'll start with just a very basic job development log. And the purpose of this would be to track employment specialist job development activities. And you can, again, set this up in any way you would like, in any format. Information at a minimum that's useful to track includes certainly the identifying information like date and time, which employment specialist, what employer did they go to. Here's one that it seems silly, but it makes a lot of sense. Location. Often, you'll look through job development logs and somebody will have a grocery store listed there, and that's fine. But most urban areas have multiple locations for the same grocery store kind of company, and often those multiple locations at those grocery stores will have different hiring managers. So it's to your advantage from a tracking perspective to know that this north side grocer, this one we have a great relationship with. We're on the third cup, whereas the west side grocer, we're still really in that second cup phase with that person because it's a different hiring manager. Also, things to track in the job development log include things that are position specific, like type of job, and what we mean there is like dishwasher, clerk, those sorts of titles. That's important in your Fidelity review because that's one of the things that the reviewers will track is what types of jobs. It's important to classify the purpose of your visit somehow. Some people literally put first cup, second cup, third cup, and that's fine. Others put things like this: learn about employer, talk about candidate, ongoing relationship. But the reason you're going there is an important thing to include on your job development log. And then certainly next visit date or next steps. There's really no great algorithm I could share with you, but I think default to common sense. The longer you wait is not necessarily the best, but then too frequent, and it's not very purposeful. So depending on the employer, depending on whether you have an applicant that's ready to go, those are all the things that will influence your next visit date or your next steps. The next tracking piece that might be good for you to have in your organization, if you don't already, is field mentoring checklist and notes. So this is really a document that shows evidence that the IPS supervisor goes out and shadows employment specialists when they perform job development. That's in the Fidelity scale. It's not under job development, it's under the IPS supervisor functions. But really, this checklist shows evidence that the supervisor is observing performance of employment specialists when they're doing job development, providing feedback, practicing skills, and even if it's a very highly trained and seasoned employment specialist, it's still a great idea for a supervisor to go out and shadow them and do the job development observation. Often what we hear supervisors saying is what they learn with their employees who are great at job development, they take back and share with their employees that maybe do need a little help with job development. And so even the supervisors are kind of getting something out of observing folks who are already good at it. The next item that's worth tracking is supervision notes or goal setting. And again, this is part of the Fidelity scale. And again, it's measured in the IPS supervisor section, not job development. But any sort of minutes or notes from either individual or group supervision sessions between the IPS supervisor and employment specialists. High Fidelity programs task the employment specialist with 6 to 8 face-to-face visits a week, and they track it within the supervision documentation. And if you go to the Fidelity scale, that I lifted that straight out of the Fidelity scale. So if you want a 5 on that particular item in the Fidelity scale, both these conditions would have to be met, that you task the employment specialists with 6 to 8 visits a week, and it's tracked in the supervision documentation. So just a little nuance there to note. And so what Dawn and I have been doing with these presentations is kind of doing a little bit of content, and then I just bring a couple questions for folks on the call to kind of reflect on. And so I would really, really appreciate it if, think about these in earnest. I'm going to bring all 3 of them up here, and feel free to respond to any of these 3. But the first one, just because I think it's kind of like the elephant in the room, what's the most challenging part of the job development process for you or your agency? And the next question here, what are methods you have used to combat the stigma some employers might have against hiring people working with your agency? And some of that is very covert, right? I will tell you, when I was an IPS supervisor, I worked for a community mental health center that was fairly large in the metropolitan area, and just saying the name of the mental health center, you could tell there was a stigma associated with clients with living with a mental illness. It was just right there, it was palpable. And so we really had to try a lot of different things to kind of get around that with employers, because as a way to introduce yourself, you're using your agency's name. So and then the third question for today is, has your agency's participation in IPS changed the way you look for applicants who would be a good fit in the employment specialist role? And so I will take a drink of my coffee real quickly here while you all process these questions.
We'll mention you can raise your hand. If you do, we'll try and unmute you so that you can speak. You can use the chat box. And there's a little, if you look under the attendees list, if you click on the arrow that points right, it'll point down and show who the attendees are and whether there are questions. So please feel free to use whichever means feels best for you, and I will help to monitor.
Thank you, Dawn.
And I would mention too, while people are thinking about it, having done Fidelity reviews, and I'm sure, Paul, you've run into this too. I tell you what, I'm going to hold that for a minute. I see Austin Hume has his hand up, and it says you're self-muted too, Austin. So you're going to want to.
Oh, can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yeah, yep, can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Austin Hume. I'm calling in. I am an employer that employs people through Job Plus through Oregon, and we are opening up a Washington office very soon. And we would like, our whole organization was founded by somebody with behavioral health needs that were not being met. And so we have a deep passion rooted in that community, and we like to be able to give back whenever possible. So as an employer, how do we reach out for these IPS specialists, or how do we put that, I guess, out there that our company is definitely a friend to the community as far as, hiring people to do job skills or to develop those and things of that nature, and that we are a very open-minded company?
That's
a great question. Yeah, that is wonderful. And Dawn, I'll jump in, and then you probably have an answer as well. So I think it's really cool what you're doing. I would bet if you asked someone like Dawn, they would be able to kind of share IPS provider, at least agency names that you could reach out to and just kind of introduce yourself organizationally. And then the footnote I'll make is IPS agencies, when they get a Fidelity review, there is some caution with placing too many people at the same employer. So, while that may be a good fit, IPS agencies might not send everybody your way just because of that kind of part of the Fidelity scale. And so that's worth noting, I guess I would say, but I still think there's tremendous opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I would say, Austin, is that you just did put out to the community that you're an agency an employer that hires. If you're willing to give your contact information and email, then I would say you're probably going to get contact from some of the individuals on this call, or they will at least pass off the information to the person that does the bulk of their job development. Paul's right. Part of IPS is that we don't want to place a number of people with behavioral health issues in one place. And so, but you might hear from, a couple of employers, or a couple, I should say, of agencies with people on their caseloads that have an interest, because we have multiple agencies across the state, 118 of them providing services. The greater portion of those are providing supported employment. One of the best ways of finding out who they are is to get onto the AmeriGroup website. And they're the third-party administrator for foundational community supports. They have a Find a Doctor tool, which seems a little odd, but it's the tool to look up to see who's providing what we call foundational community supports, whether it's supported employment, and what town they are in. So if you had an interest in doing a little research yourself, that's probably the easiest
I love research.
way to do it. Yeah, and then keeping my contact information handy is a good way to research as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we do behavioral health transportation as a company. And we specialize in providing people with from adolescents. We transport children as young as 6 months old to adults that just need a little bit of extra care when it comes to understanding and compassion and safe transport. So, we work very closely in the community. We were in Arizona, we branched to Oregon, and now we're coming into Washington. And we're really excited about offering, not only jobs and things like that, but just like, we love being a part of the community and being able to be a support to, especially the people in the behavioral health, because they do have such a stigma.
Right.
Sometimes attached to them. And sometimes people have a lot of misconceived notions just about the whole behavioral health in general. So
Absolutely.
we're really looking forward to being a part of this community, definitely.
So you're not only an
where do
employer,
I get my contact info at?
You could put your contact information in the chat box for people to see. Do please put in also the name of your organization, because you're obviously not just an employer, but a resource as well. So if you look down at the bottom of the
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead and do you see where it says chat? And if you click the arrow that normally
is that what I'm looking at?
There's a list of options on the right side of your screen that have little arrows arrows next to them. If you look at the one on the bottom, it says chat. If you click on the arrow that points right, it will point down and open up a box where you can type in your information. What's the name of your company?
Our name is Comtrans, COMTRANS.
Okay. Marvelous.
I'm looking for that box. I am and our website, because my screen's kind of being funny here.
Okay,
I'm on my tablet, of course.
I'm typing in information as you're talking, so I'll be your typist for the moment. So Comtrans.
Thank you. Our website is www.comtrans.com. That website will tell you all the community involvement that we're in. It's very Arizona focused because we're newly established on the West Coast. But right now we're working with Portland Public Schools and Reynolds with their special education students, with CARD, which is an autistic center, LifeWorks, and Cascadia Behavioral Health, along with the Ride to Care program. So
Wonderful.
We've really integrated ourselves in Oregon.
All right, and I see some folks, other folks have questions, and part of that may be for you. So I'm going to call upon the next person, and we'll go from there. Thank you, Austin, very much. I see Paul. You bet. Paul has his hand raised. Paul, did you still want to ask a question?
Paul, me?
Paul Vose. Sorry.
No. Can you hear me?
Paul, I have you unmuted.
How about now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Good stuff. Paul, I was just wondering you might have mentioned this, but when you go out and shadow your staff in the field there, how often are you doing that? Is it monthly? Every couple of months?
That's a great question. So I think it depends on, let me pull out my super nerdy Fidelity reviewer manual. There's a gradient. I know, I hear Dawn laughing, but I know you got one too, probably, Dawn. So
yes, I do. Electronically and paper copy.
Yeah, it's really nice to have, actually, because there's so many little specific things under each item that you could never remember every single one. I think, Paul, that the frequency depends upon your overall Fidelity score. So, for example, if you had an agency that's got exemplary Fidelity, it might be once every 6 months. But if you're a newer team that is still establishing Fidelity, the presumption would be more often would be better than less often. So monthly would make a lot of sense. I'm going to keep trying to find that. Because of course I can't find it, but only because I'm looking for it, right?
Yeah. Well, and while you're talking, or while you're looking for that, Paul Phares, I will say, Paul Vose, that one of the things that we did as an agency was we did monthly until the person was performing well. And so once they were performing well, we backed it off to the level that they felt like they needed. So monthly perhaps became once every 3 months, perhaps then became once every 6 months.
Yeah, Dawn, that's almost, this is Paul Phares, that's almost like a competency for a new
Yep.
employee, it sounds like, and that's a really great approach. That's a very, very good approach. Holy moly.
It's not wanting to show up. Yeah.
No, let's see here. Here it is.
And Lisa, I see you have your hand up. I'll get to you next if you're still wanting to ask a question. But we'll finish with the question with Paul Phares first, and then I'll get to you next.
So it says here, to receive credit for this component, supervisors provide monthly field mentoring with anyone who is new or having difficulty with job development. So there's that. So for example, if fewer than 40% of the people on a specialist caseload are employed, or if an employment specialist has fewer than 3 job starts each quarter, the supervisor would provide monthly field mentoring.
Okay.
So yeah, and if you don't have a copy of the Fidelity scale, I encourage you to get a copy, because a lot of these things are, that's exactly how a reviewer would evaluate it. And so, if you also can get a copy of the Fidelity Review Manual, that might be out there too. That's another nice thing to have, just to explain some of those rationale behind a measure. Good question.
I have sent those out electronically. If somebody needs them, I can do so again when I send out the recording to this webinar.
Thank you.
All right. So on to Lisa. And actually, we have some typed questions, so I'll read those. Lisa says, we're always looking for new providers to come into Lewis County, Great Rivers Behavioral Health, Community Integrated Health Services. I can forward information to my supervisor. Looks like she's responding back to Austin. And Austin had put her email address, which is ahume@gocomtrans.com. And then Lane has said, hi Lane, do you have or would you share a template for evaluating performance? And what I will do is send along the Fidelity scale, and then as we were talking about the book also. Okay, and Lisa, did you get to give all the information that you wanted to give? I'm going to unmute you, so in case you wanted to talk, you are.
No, I didn't. I just wanted the young lady to know that we're always looking for people to come to our community to bring new supported foundational supports and new recovery capital for our community members. So I just always raise my hand and say, come on down. We need more. We need more. And thank you for what you do.
Wonderful. Good, good, good. And I see Austin also put her direct cell phone number, which I'm going to read off in case folks can't see it. 602-327-9835. And let me know if I need to repeat that again. And Lisa, I'm not sure if you were able to fully get your information provided, so I've still got you unmuted if you had anything else you wanted to say.
I wrote all her information down, and I will just reach out to her. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm glad that Austin spoke up today. If anyone else has questions, do please raise your hand or use the chat box if you can find it. I understand there's some difficulties with that. I see Angela and Austin both have their hands raised. Angela, I've got, since you're on the top of the list, I have you unmuted first. Are you there, Angela? Angela Messer. Or do you still have a question? All right. So I'm muted again. I'm going back to Austin, who is also self-muted. So if you wanted to say something else, Austin, I see your hand raised. Do please feel free to unmute yourself. And you can add whatever comment you might want to make. Okay. All right. Anyone else that has questions, please feel free to raise your hand type in the chat box. Folks have been typing in where the section says questions, and you can do any of those. I'd been going to say one of the challenges as a supervisor, because I was a supervisor, was to be able to track in a pretty easy way how many employer contacts that employment specialists were making per week. And we had a log that we had the employment specialist enter information into that would include where they'd been, what the date was, that kind of thing, and then their name, so that it was an easy way to count. Have there been 6 in this week, yes or no? If there wasn't, one of the things that we did was in supervision, we discussed strategies for how are you going to get out more often? Are you going to schedule a time block in your calendar every week, the same block to go out and talk to employers? You know, are you going to go out when you're with certain individuals, or, you know, how are you going to increase that number? So as a supervisor, I made a point of talking in every supervision about how you're doing with job development, because it's so key. You know, as Paul was talking about, it's so absolutely key.
And Dawn, this is Paul Phares again. That also has an impact elsewhere in the Fidelity scale, because agencies are evaluated on how much time they spend in the community. So having a very robust job development log also contributes to that item as well.
Very good point. And in fact, I can send out that participant log that I mentioned. It's 2-in-1. It's one that we've used kind of throughout the state. It's an Excel document that has different tabs, and one of them is a job development log. And in the same Excel document on a separate tab is a participant log. So you can flip over to that and look at the participant's name, see when they entered the program, see when the first date was of contact with an employer, see when they got a job and what the wage was and what the job title was and that kind of thing. So it's a really pretty all-encompassing document in order for a supervisor to track and make it a whole lot easier than reading through every progress note. I see Austin does still have a question. Okay, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we
there
got
we go. And this is more of like, say I have a employee who, you know, I've worked with an IPS to get employed, and they do start having difficulty. What level of information am I allowed to share with their worker, or like to get a collaborative kind of like troubleshooting, or, you know, is there a limit of information, or like certain information we are allowed to share about that employee and their actions, or like for confidentiality reasons, are we not allowed to share? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think it makes sense. And so if you're asking as an IPS provider, what kind of information are you able to share with the employer? Is that what you're asking? I guess let me stop there.
No, as an employer, say through the agency, I hire Bob. Mm-hmm. And Bob starts to have some behavioral issues that are affecting his job performance and possibly, you know, his employment with my company. Mm-hmm. Am I allowed to share those concerns with his agency, or am I bound by confidentiality of my employee not to share what's going on?
Yep, this is a great question, and it's the other direction from what I'm used to. I'm used to IPS agencies asking me what kind of information can I share with an employer, but you're saying as an employer, what can I share with the agency when I notice something at work? And so the short answer is it depends, and I know that's a lousy answer, but the longer answer is IPS agencies work pretty regularly with their clients on disclosing the fact that they have some sort of whatever the condition might be, that they're living with some sort of condition, so that the agency can be involved in those conversations. And as you might not be surprised to hear that some people are willing to disclose to an employer that they're living with a condition and might need some help. Other people are not willing to disclose, and some people are kind of in the middle, that some days they want to disclose, or some things they want to disclose, but other things they don't. So I guess a better way for me to answer your question would be, if an IPS agency was working with Bob in your example, and they had been talking with Bob about disclosing his illness to you as an employer, you would know on the front end, because that employment specialist would be kind of reaching out to you as a potential source of support in case you notice anything, or Bob might be telling you, when you're pulling Bob in and saying, Bob, you can't do that, Bob may be saying, well, maybe we should call my employment specialist. And, so hopefully if Bob decides to disclose to you as an employer, you would know all of that on the front end. However, if Bob was one of those folks that didn't want to disclose, sometimes exactly what you're talking about is what has to happen in order for Bob to decide to disclose, because Bob will have to decide and make a decision that I want to keep the job, therefore I need the support, therefore I need to have my employment specialist authorized via a disclosure to talk with my employer. Does that make sense?
It does. And see, like with employees like Bob, I myself have a behavioral health diagnosis that I share literally with all my employees, because Comtrans actually came into my life in that instance about 10 years ago now. And now I am a regional director for them. So,
Great.
They actually brought me on through an IPS agency. I started out with them as a line level IPS employee. So my passion for this is kind of self-rooted too.
Oh, sure. I think.
But with Bob, I always encourage especially my employees that if they do happen to have a behavioral health diagnosis or anything, I always encourage them to the disability disclosure so that they are protected in more ways, and I like to have them as much protection as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and I
absolutely.
also like to I work with a couple different teams. I have an employee that has schizophrenia. Now, some days are really awesome days, and other days, we come together as a team and just, it should be a mental health day, and we'll try again tomorrow type situation. So,
right.
We don't really have a guideline as an employer on the appropriateness of when we do start having behavioral problems at work, or, disciplinary actionable things happen, like what level of information that we're allowed to disclose or is, deemed appropriate. So I guess.
Great questions.
That chapter hasn't been officially written yet.
I do see that Tina Mitchell had said we have consent forms that we use with our clients to help them with information sharing. And that specific discussion about what can we share, what can't we share. I think as an employer, it's just very respectful to ask the person, I'd like to talk with your employment specialist. Are you okay with me doing that? Can I tell them, kind of a thing? You'd hope that they would say yes. Okay. If they say no, then the employment specialist can't truly help you. Right. And that's a fact of the matter. So you're in the odd position of being somebody that has to be HIPAA compliant for the business that you do, as well as the fact that you're working with individuals, and so that ends up being interesting too. But thank you, Tina, for that comment.
And thank you. I appreciate all your time, you guys. I'll mute myself and let somebody else talk.
It was nice talking with you, Austin. Thank you so much. Okay, so I see, and Lane, I had seen your question and half of it was cut off. It says, do you have or would you share a template for evaluating performance of employment specialists while shadowing? On the IPS website, there's a field mentoring log or sheet or whatever you call it. There's actually field mentoring that's done while people are doing job development. There's field mentoring that's also done or can be done just while people are with individuals to kind of provide them feedback about how they're doing. So I can find those and also send them along with the recording and the PowerPoint today. Other questions? Angela, it looks like you still have your hand up. Angela Messer, if you have something you want to say. Oh, and I see Elaine says, great, I can look those up too. Cool. Angela, if you still have something to say, you're unmuted. And then if anybody else wants to raise their hand or ask a question, please do. I see we've got about 4 minutes left. Okay, looks like Angela doesn't have a question. I have a sort of a funny story. I did field mentoring on job development with a gentleman who was far better than I was about doing job development because he came from a sales and marketing position. So we taught him the social service side of things as opposed to hiring somebody that was essentially a case manager or social worker and teaching them the job development side of things. So I was going with him one day to do that mentoring and said, you know, what can I possibly help with? And he said, women's clothing store. I just don't get it. I need some
That's awesome.
It was funny. And we did that, and he actually said that he did learn from me. So you never can tell.
It's true. And, that's really what I was looking for with that last question, Dawn, is, agencies that have been doing IPS services for a long time eventually learn that, that kind of stereotypical case manager that you teach how to do the sales part of IPS, it's not bad or wrong, but really you can get lightning in a bottle if you find somebody who's trained in sales and you teach them kind of the clinical side of things. Mm-hmm. And often what I hear from some very high performing employment specialists with a history of sales in their background is that this is like the best part of sales because I actually feel like I'm helping people. It is really awesome. And those are people who they don't have any problem getting up in the morning and coming into work to go do a cold call at a business with an employer they've never talked with before because that's exciting for them. Yeah. And it's just kind of an interesting thing to hear that, what used to be you'd get an application for a case manager and, they worked in sales 2 or 3 jobs. You kind of maybe turn your nose up at that. You want somebody with more clinical experience, but there are agencies that I've been to that really that is the ideal candidate for an employment specialist position is somebody who's only had work in sales. They can teach all the rest.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about the other piece. He said to me at one point in time when we were doing supervision, he said, I thought when I took this job I was going to be bored, that it wouldn't be enough. He said, I thought the thrill of the sale would be gone. He said, this is better.
Yeah.
So it actually did. The fact that what he was selling, if you will, was so meaningful and made such a difference to the people on his caseload. He said, this is better. So I thought that was incredibly cool.
Yeah, very cool.
We have a couple of minutes left. Are there any other questions? Looks like we've gone through the list. So I guess my question would be, if people have other things that you're hoping to get as far as documentation and that kind of thing when I send out the thank you, please shoot me an email if you would, please. I'm going to send out the participant log, field mentoring, Fidelity review, Fidelity scale, and the slides so that you all have access to those things. If there's something else you're hoping to get, please send me an email and I'll make sure that you get that as well. Would also mention related to the fact that within the state of Washington, we are IPS trainers, but we're just trainers in general. If your agency needs some training of some sort, please feel free to reach out to me or to Lisa Bennett Perry. Paul, did you have any final thoughts?
No, it's been a great discussion. I really appreciate everybody getting involved.
Yeah, marvelous. Absolutely, I would agree. Thank you so much too, Paul, for your presentation and the information you share. I always learn something. That's a good thing.
Thank you.
All right. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar today. And when Paul is very timely about sending me his slides, I will get all that information sent out to you. Have a marvelous day. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dawn. Bye.